So picture this. I'm sitting with my wife and family, and I've got some friends over, and we're talking about work. And then they start talking about, one of their devices that stopped working. And immediately my mind goes into troubleshooting mode, right? You start asking questions. And they remember I asked a barrage of questions, and the gentleman said, I don't understand, how do you know so much about, electronics or the mechanical things and how they work? He's like, you're able to just look at it and really figure it out. And I thought, okay, this would be kind of an interesting topic to talk about. So I kind of went through about, where I kind of learned, the background and how I learned. And they said, don't you do a YouTube? That'd be a great video. So this is a little bit, it's really actually a recommendation from that friend. And just, curious to see what all of you think. So feel free to leave a comment. But what I wanted to do was use a guide. This is a book that I've had for about 3 weeks. I got it at a estate sale for $1. I'm going to use this book as a guide to talk about certain things that I've learned, certain things that I did well, certain things that I didn't, maybe a couple of stories in my background. So it's a bit personal. It kind of talks about the journey of how I became an electrical engineer, how I work in IT security and systems and IT, and how I fix everything around the house that I possibly can, with the exception of a few things, and we'll talk through that. So hopefully, if you're kind of grew up the same way, figuring things out yourself, it will bring back some memories. And hopefully there'll be something that you can learn. And again, feel free to leave some comments on your feedback and some of the things that you've learned when you were growing up. Because for me, I'm constantly learning. I'm constantly finding out I'm wrong all the time. And as much as I don't like it, I constantly find out I have to do that to move forward. So it is what it is. And that's really the best way to advance forward, get to work with new things, and develop some new things. So I'm going to use this Reader's Digest, again, as I said, just as an index to help me think of what to talk about and talk through. And then here is the ISBN if you want to take a look at it. I think it's a pretty great book. And I will start off and say that we're going to talk a little bit about home electronics, something I'm very familiar with. But before I get to that, this is certainly not the first book I had that has these lovely types of diagrams. I love these books. I feel like I learn so much about how something works. There's always the secret part of electronic or device I'm trying to take apart, right? And analyze, smell, taste, listen to, feel the vibrations of, whatever it takes for me to really figure out how things work. These books tend to be sometimes oversimplified. It's intentional, but they tend to sometimes give a false assertiveness or confidence that may not necessarily exude when you try and actually disassemble something, but that's okay. That's what I love about these books. And I have, 4 or 5. I have still the one that I grew up with. It's a little bit tattered and torn, but still functional. And sometimes I go through that and I go, gosh, what was I thinking then? So it's always just really fun. So let me get straight to it. We're going to talk about all of these topics we're going to go through. I actually highlighted a whole bunch of things, but home electronics, I just put 2 here to tell me don't even go and start bookmarking. Go through everything. So hopefully you enjoyed. Again, feel free to leave comments, and I'll talk again. What did I learn? What did I not learn? Maybe some stories to kind of back up some of the things, and hopefully this will be helpful to some of you. So the first thing that they cover here is toolbox. Now, there are, in my mind, only a handful of tools that you need to get started. The first thing you need is plus and minus screwdrivers. And I know for those purists, you're saying, Daniel, what's plus and minus? Well, it just means Phillips and flathead. I, for the longest time, for some reason, couldn't remember Phillips when I was young. So I just remembered it as, there's your plus screwdriver, and there's your minus, right? Or flathead and Phillips. There's a whole bunch more, right? There's Torx, there's ones that are square, there's diamonds, there's a whole bunch of these. And that's why something like this becomes quite handy, is if you get a tool that's got a little bit of everything. And when I grew up, I had like dozens of these, and I still have dozens, if not more now, thanks to everything's getting smaller. I end up having to have some even ones miniature, because that's just the way that electronics have gone. So still have 2 or 3 of these as well. But obviously it's essential that you have those tools and a bunch of them. So Phillips, flathead, different sizes, sometimes different materials. You want some that are plastic, most of the time just metal, and a couple of small. I usually have about half a dozen small size and half a dozen big size of each one. And literally 90% of all my screwdrivers, and I'm looking around my shop right now, I think I got a estate or a garage sale. So do yourself a favor. If you can buy a new one, great. If you can afford it, otherwise, you'll be good to go. Side cutters, needle nose, ton of these. I probably have about half a dozen of those. These are the kinds of things that you want to invest quality in. So if you're thinking about getting some or updating, get yourself some nice new ones. Invest in good quality ones. There are many videos that talk about brand, etc. Here's a very beautiful long needle nose pliers. You really want to make sure that the sides lie flat at the tip, see right here, and it's parallel as much as absolutely possible all the way down. So this tells you that as you grip into something, you can really squish down completely flat on a ribbon, cable, etc. So very useful to get into small things, nooks and crannies, and also get yourself to make sure you get some side cutters that are really, really, really sharp, and that really makes sense, because I think that as you start looking through and start using some of these, this will be super handy. And absolutely dental picks. Believe it or not, these are so useful. Get some on a nice website. I don't know. See if you can find some absolutely useful picks. You'd be surprised how often you use them. I've got a handful. Again, sorry, I'm going to receipt it again. Estate sale. Now, when I was younger, I didn't have this. When I was younger, I had my mom's knife set. She was not pleased. I had forks and spoons. She was not pleased. So do yourself a favor, save yourself the embarrassment stories and having to pay for that later on. Get yourself some of these if you're young and you want to play around with it, because these type of small nook cranny tools come in quite handy. And jewelry screwdriver set, touched on it a bit, but just make sure you get yourself some nice ones. When you're first starting off, get yourself a nice cheap set. There are some more expensive ones that I had for longer term. They feel nice. They feel good. When you're working with small electronics like watches, they're great. You really need something precision, and they need a hold, because there are a lot of weaknesses with a small screwdriver set, especially with these jewelry driver sets. See, you can see here as an example in this picture, right? They're made out of plastic, and then they got a piece of metal. So if a piece of or if a screw is really tight and you're cranking on this, all of a sudden the plastic will separate, and then you'll be turning the plastic, but the Phillips or the flathead isn't going anywhere. It happens a lot when you're using these, and you obviously just need that part, and all of a sudden, you can't get to it. So use cheap one right now. Don't go get anything expensive, but later on, see if you can find one that's all metal. It will do yourself a solid favor. Get yourself a cheap soldering iron and some solder. Don't get anything special, especially starting off. Later on, you can get yourself a Heiko or something that's more expensive if you need to do something more precise. But honestly, 99% of everything I've done, I could have used this with. I don't need anything fancy. If you're doing very small circuitry, SMD, you'll see a video I did recently where I was still able to use a soldering iron, Heiko, to solder something like this. And it wasn't even designed to do it. So if you do it right with a little bit of skill, you can absolutely make out with one of these just fine. And then a couple other things. Multimeter. I've got a great multimeter video. So feel free to view that on how to use it. Incredibly important if you're working with voltage, low voltage, 12 volt, 9 volt, 1.5, high voltage, 120, 240, 60. Make sure you know how to use a multimeter. A voltmeter and the resistance, so the ohm meter, the voltmeter, those two are really critically important. And then you also have continuity test. So take a look at my video, but that's really important to learn how to use that. And really that's it. You don't need to go through great lengths to get yourself a tremendous expensive tool set bench. Most of what we talk about in this book, especially in these pages, they're going to just involve this. Now, when you're young, you probably don't need a magnifying glass. I'm getting to the point now where I'm using them, so it is what it is. I think I have, see, I've got a whole bunch of these I had from different things I took apart. I think this was from a projector. But, you know, it does come in handy if you're starting to look at very, very small electronics. All right, so let's just jump into the first thing, and let's see what memories come up. So this talks about troubleshooting. We're going to skip this for now. This is not Let's go here. Actually, hold on a second. Hold on. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about battery contacts. Now, everyone knows that these smaller, especially toys nowadays, require batteries, right? AA, AAA, 3-volt, 1-volt specialized batteries. Here's a couple of them right here. One thing when I was small, and I'll probably mention it throughout here, is I was infamous for fixing small electronics because they just didn't work after a while. They'd say, oh, I put fresh new batteries in, and they just didn't work. And I always found it fascinating because the number one problem was usually not the electronic itself, but it was the batteries leaking. So here's this remote, but it didn't matter, right? I would open this up and I'd see a bunch of acid here, or I'd see some collecting right here from these batteries leaking, right? And unfortunately, that's what caused the contacts not to make good contact, electrical contact. So basically all that acid became an insulator. So it didn't transfer electricity back and forth. And I thought that was always so fun because I'd be called a genius when I was younger and great job. And how'd you figure out? Come on, man. The contacts were messy, right? Now, I didn't tell anyone because I have a reputation I have to hold. But believe it or not, that was the number one problem. So what did I do to go and repair those? Well, there was a couple things. The first thing is, just like that picture showed, I used a pencil eraser. Sometimes that worked. I do that like really quick, really hard because I was so excited. And then I'd blow into the contacts, right, to get the eraser stuff out of there, right? Because I'm taking the eraser and I'm just scrubbing it in there. I'm just so excited. And then I put the battery back in and I go blow it off. And then, oh, does it work? Does it work? Woohoo, woohoo, I fixed it. So I was always so excited. That was the first thing when I was young that I had to deal with. Now, in today's world, the batteries are better. They're different technology. They don't leak as much. Although, don't think for a moment they don't leak, because I got a fresh new set a couple of weeks ago and then they leaked. So go figure. I won't mention the brand. So this is kind of where I first got a little bit of feedback, positive feedback, like, wow, Daniel, you know how to fix something, even if it's as simple as that. And in my mind, I thought this was the simplest thing anyone could try, but many people didn't. The other things that I would do is, if it was stubborn, I would use sandpaper. So you could take sandpaper, you rub it around something sharp. It can be this, or an eraser is a little better because it has a little bit of give and it can move. And then I would just rub it against the contact with sandpaper for a moment to really get that stuff off, blowing it a couple times, and usually that solved the problem. So that's what they're showing here, is here's how to use a pencil eraser. But I can tell you that, at least during my childhood, I probably repaired dozens and dozens. Small train sets that moved around had the same thing, right? You lift up the train or a quick car, and it's got these pads on the bottom, and you would scrub those. Or maybe they were made out of metal that started to corrode because of the air or wear and tear. And so that was one of the things I did, and it just brings back memories when I see that. And today I'm actually still doing that. I can open up some devices that don't work well and rub off some of that acid. So taking a look at this again, this is the troubleshooting part. Motors, DC motors, certainly when I was a kid, definitely looking at every single type of thing I could take apart. Ask my mom. She still is she still is quite disappointed how much stuff I took apart. But we're going to skip this page because this is just the basics of solder. Plenty of videos that now show how to do that. You don't need to get too fancy. Don't get anything expensive, especially if you're starting off. That important. One thing I do find interesting is this is something that I was a kid, I probably would have completely ignored, right? Which is right here. Coaxial crimping and cabling. I used to work for several companies when I was in college that I would go and repair their electronics. I won't name them, but basically it'd say, hey, we need someone to look at an audio device, or we need to have, 55 Cat 6 cable or Cat 5e cables dropped. And believe it or not, that skill I learned when I was young on crimping, using pliers and looking at how to put the coaxial or RJ45 or RJ12 to an RJ11 box, etc. I remember all of that. That experience has come with me. And actually, believe it or not, a lot of where I made my money and paid for my first college that I went to actually was dropping wires through 2x4s, through ceilings. installing access points, installing Cat5 and Cat6 for networking, racking and stacking equipment. And the beauty of that is I learned that when I was young, when I was 9 or 10, most of that just playing around with wires and just knowing how to use the equipment. I was comfortable with it, and so it was really easy. So it's kind of interesting how when you grow up, you do something, or you teach yourself, self-learn, and all of a sudden that's paying for your college. But sure enough, I paid for 2/3 of my college basically just dropping wire. So that was pretty crazy. Back in the day, some of the things that I used to repair, VCRs, amplifiers, tape decks was a big one. I mean, tape decks always seem to have an issue. Didn't seem to last very long. And then, just the odds and ends, irons and stuff. So let me just flip through here. Oh, hell, here we go. So let's take a look at that. So VCR, one of the first things I got to really take apart that was complex, and I still don't know what most of this stuff does. Yes, I have an engineering degree. No, I haven't really looked into it, although I could probably get a fair amount of good guess. But I remember replacing these. Some of the issues that these typically had is either the reader was dirty. So in this case, what is this? Oh, this is a compact disc player, so CD player. It was usually the laser was dirty, so you take a Q-tip with a dab of alcohol, you rub it on the laser, and you see if that solved the problem. Second thing, check the battery compartment. Is it leaking of acid? That was another thing that used to cause like intermittent issues in play. This one obviously is designed for putting it on like underneath the TV, like you stack them, but obviously a portable CD player is the same way. One of the cool things I did, I think I got a video on it with a portable one, is I had the unit apart. And back in the day, everyone knows if you had this and you were thumping music, boop, 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 and it would skip, right? Just almost like a CD, and it would do that because it was basically playing in real time, taking the data on the CD, right? Reflecting it from the CD, bringing it in, re-encoding it, and distributing it through its digital to audio converter, and then out the speakers or through an amplifier. So that's how these kind of worked, right? But the problem was it was real time. So if the CD stopped, your music stopped, or if it bumped. Cool thing is, years later, they put something in there called memory. Everyone knows what memory is. We take it granted. I saw an old video one time, and it was talking about IBM, like, and it has memory. But what made this difference? Why does that matter? Because you could now even jog with these CD Discmans. Sony made a very famous one. And you could literally go jogging with them. And so how that worked is it basically would spin faster than the normal play. And it would read ahead. So even though it's playing music at, call it normal 1.0 speed, it would read ahead like 1.3, 1.4 times faster. And so what that would do is it'd start remembering everything, dumping it into memory. So if the CD stopped, it would still continue to play because now it's playing from the memory that it already had. So if it had, and of course they call that a buffer. So if it had a 20-second buffer or a 10-second buffer, that just means it had 10 or 20 seconds to hurry up, get that CD up and running, and hopefully start getting that data collected as it was playing the rest of the storage. Once that's done, hopefully the CD's ramping up fast enough, it plays, no interruption, no one noticed whatsoever. So pretty neat thing, prelude to many MP3 players, but that was certainly one thing that was really cool. Another thing that typically failed on these was this guy right here. So one thing that I always found interesting is on these CD players, or compact disc if you prefer, these heads, so you've got the laser head right here, right? This is the laser head that I'd wipe with a soft towel. A lot of times these heads that go back and forth that carry the laser, a lot of times they were clogged, or I needed to add some grease, and then they started working up and down again. But for the most part, I would say short of these 2 or 3 troubleshooting things, I hate to say it, but there wasn't a lot you could do to repair them. If they were really going out and you've done 2 or 3 things, you've looked at the spindle and it's flat, you've looked at the laser and it's able to move back and forth, there was not much you could fix on it. Kind of a prelude to what we get to a lot of the electronics today, but still nonetheless really, really fun. Of course, we've got the turntable, right? Record player. I've got one of these that's about 35 years old. You know where I got it from. Pretty basic motor, a needle that reads from the data from the cartridge and carries it, and then you typically needed an amplifier to amplify the signal. It's kind of interesting. I would have thought turntables should have come before compact disc player, but regardless. So this talks a little bit about repairing these. I actually found one of these, believe it or not, when I was 9 or 10 years old. I found a record player underneath, outside, under a porch of my neighbor's yard across the alleyway. I was that bored. I was going under porches of my neighbor's house, and sure enough, I found one of these. I took it apart. It was greasy. It was nasty. I threw the thing out after like 5 hours of playing with it because I still needed to know how it worked. I don't think I ever got it plugged in, but I remember, this is beautiful. Look how clean this is. I mean, this is something you could buy today and go, wow, this is amazing. That thing was made out of wood, and it had so much grease. The one thing that I will give credit to is this, I'm going to call it a platen. Oh, okay, well, they call it a platter, but this platter or platen, today, this is made out of plastic. It's very light. That actually can contribute to music. In the old ones, the ones that were made 20, 35 years ago, these were all metal. And there was actually a reason for that. It's because the metal has much more mass. And so once you got it up to speed, it didn't slow down a little bit here, a little bit there, because it had momentum to keep on going. So if you were gyrating to good music and it was very loud, this heavy platen roller or platter would continue to move just because it's so heavy. And these plastic ones that I have today are more susceptible to bumps and stuff. So that was something that I would call keeping this metal. That's good quality, but you typically don't see that today. They're all made out of plastic. Okay, cassettes and VHS, very, very similar. Some of the things that I used to do. First thing, let's just give a shout out to cassettes. We still use them today. Not only if you want to be retro, but if you work in IT at all, most of the time you've got backups. And believe it or not, many, many corporations, enterprises, small businesses still back their data up. What are they backing it on? Tape drives. What are those? Tapes. These guys. Yes, they look different. Yes, it encodes the data different. It's essentially the exact same thing. You can't repair one like you can do this because it's audio and that one's data. But regardless, it actually has storage similar to this. So believe it or not. And why is that, by the way? Well, because, the way that the magnetic is encoded on the tapes, it can last 20, 30 years. Yes, it's going to have some degradation, especially of the tape. It can lose some of its magnetic field and kind of lose some of the data, and that's a little bit of a risk. But the reality is, if you take a look at what else can you store data on that last 25 years, not very much. Maybe a CD, but not near as much data. Some of these tape drives can do 20, 40, 80 gigs. I think some of them are bigger. I don't know for sure. But I know they can do some that are 80 gigs. That's a huge amount of data. So people still use tape drives. So knowing how one works is kind of cool. A big issue with these is they just get dirty a ton. So you can see here, because they usually had a big door and dust and stuff could collect in there. You put tapes that you held from your pocket or you took from your car and you brought it home. It had something on it, and then it got into the tape drive. So they typically had a big door in order for you to put the tape in. So dirt and gunk got in there. So that's why the first thing they say is, oh yeah, make sure you clean that head and get a nice cotton swab. Probably should add that to the list of tools. And then you would clean that, the reader, the recorder, and the head. And that 9 out of 10 times helped. I always clean these pinch rollers. They're made out of hard rubber. And I always like to clean those because they like to trap dirt and absorb some of it. And you'd get sometimes weird playing. You're like, why is it? When you couldn't figure it out, it's usually because the tape wraps around this roller very tight or taut against both rollers. And if one of these has a bump in it, they tend to kind of sometimes change the speed as it's playing. So make sure you wipe these rollers if you're trying to figure that out. The other things they show is just putting some alcohol, denatured alcohol, to clean these belts. I like to call them rubber bands, but they're not. They're belts. And again, making sure you got dirt and everything is off that so that it plays as smoothly as possible. If you're in a pinch and you don't have these specific belts, believe it or not, rubber bands work. I've replaced many cassette recorders with rubber bands and had zero problem with them. So depending on what it is, it actually still works. Speakers, I've repaired too many. I remember this one thing, and I don't know why, it just sticks in my memory, but I was on a bicycle. This was in Minnesota. It was a cool, crisp, I would say, kind of summer morning, about 7:30 or 8 a.m. And I was going to my grandma's house, and I was on a bike. And you may have figured out by now, like, if when I see something, I want to take it apart, especially if it's free. And about half mile to my grandparents' home, only had like 5 more blocks. And I saw that someone had thrown away a speaker, like just tossed it out. The excitement in the air. What's in it? Can I have it? Is it good quality? Does it work? Guys, I didn't have an amplifier. I mean, I just wanted to take the thing apart, figure out how it works, smell the material, look at it, feel the texture of it. You know, I didn't, it's not like I had a room where I'd say, oh, great, I've got these new satellite speakers and I can put them with my subwoofer and I can have 5.1 surround sound. None of that. It was the thrill. It was the understanding. It was, how did they do this? How did they architect what's inside? And so I remember that story because it was free. It was out there and I took it. And the neighbors were probably happy because they didn't have to get that hauled away. But definitely it took these apart. They're pretty straightforward. I mean, either it's going to work or it's not going to work, right? If it's got a tear in it, basically good as dead. I mean, yes, there's some ways to fix them, and I've fixed some that had tears in them, but really it's usually not worth it. But if you're going to take it apart and get it out of there, you might as well, especially today, get one that's cheap, that's, well, let's say economical, and play around with it. But big subwoofer, and of course you typically had the mid-range, and I'd call it the tweeter. Plenty of these magnets are handy. Don't put them around old CRT or the glass TVs because it will mess with its magnetic field and make everything very colorful. But I still use some of these. If you ever see someone in IT, right, or just anywhere, and you see a bunch of magnets, especially if it looks like this, like in the back of it, because typically what you do is when the speaker is bad, right, the driver doesn't work anymore, so you take this magnet and you pull it off and everything else is discarded, right? The coil cap, the cone, the ring, everything. So you take this, and people used to stick it and, hold things with it. So if you ever see a bunch of old magnets, especially if it looks just like this one, here's probably a better picture there. And you see someone like this, just know right off the bat, this is someone who knows where they came from, took it apart themselves, and is probably pretty proud of them because they're useful and they're fun. And they can be pretty strong. A prelude to these neodymium magnets that you find everywhere now, because some of these could really take some skin off if you weren't careful. When I was young, I did use a soldering iron once in a while. Typically, I didn't. I rarely ever used a volt or an ohm meter, right? Now I've got plenty of them. I use them all the time. I kind of wish I had someone when I was young to show me how to use them. Kind of wish I had YouTube when I was young, because this would have saved me a hell of a lot of trouble. Sometimes I was pulling up components to test them to try and figure out if a fuse was blown, if a diode was working correctly. And I didn't really I had these tools. They existed. I don't think they were that expensive. And they were around when, what's that brand that sort of kind of exists? Black & Decker, right? So no doubt you could have gotten a multimeter for Black & Decker for $20 back in the day, but just never had and never knew really how to get it or how to use it. So if you are young or you're old and you're trying to figure out in between that range how to use a multimeter, go and figure that out. I said, I've got a video, but it's absolutely one of those tools you need to have. When you have a screwdriver set and a plier set, you need to have a multimeter set. Very handy. And believe it or not, I have more speakers around the house than one. Cameras, all of these cameras, right, from the Polaroid old ones, right, to Canon. I've taken all of these apart before. I love keeping the lenses. I love looking at the motors, the stepper motors, and how some of these work. I just find it incredibly fascinating how small everything's gotten today. Almost unknowingly, I'm fascinated about it because now it's so hard to do anything with. You know, when you had these 35 millimeter cameras, they broke. Hell, it was worth so much, it was worth fixing, right? When this broke back in the day, it was worth fixing. Now, if you get one that's $400, if it's out of warranty, you have two choices. Fix it yourself or kind of take the lens off and trash it. I hate to say it, but a lot of times they're so expensive because they're so difficult to take apart. They have so many screws, and they design them not to really be serviceable. And that plays a big deal in what you can do. I still service them. If I need to take apart, I'm absolutely not going to be shy about taking anything apart. But just be forewarned that a lot of these electronics these days are truly designed so you can't take them apart. If you look at a video I posted up with a Surface Pro or Surface Laptop Duo or whatever, I replaced a component on it. But I had to take plastic stuff on the back, on the side to get the screws off. And of course it doesn't go back on because they glued it. So it's really, really crappy that the way that a lot of these manufacturers have gone. But anyway, I only say that because if you can get your hands on an older camera, Salvation Army, Goodwill store, whatever it is, go get one. Go take it apart. If you break it, who cares, right? It's not life and death, but I can tell you that there's a lot of good things you can learn in there. How to work with electrical ribbons that you see in there, and they're not high voltage, so you don't have to really worry about getting shocked or cutting yourself. They're small parts, but it's very, very low risk. But I've absolutely repaired these. I repaired on these smaller ones a couple of stepper motors, which are very specialized motors that can move a specific step, right, or a specific degree within a circle. And I've repaired some of them in those lenses, but I can tell you it takes some phenomenal dexterity to be able to do that. So here's cameras. Believe it or not, we're still cleaning camera lenses, so that's good. Here's a good example of them cleaning the contacts. So again, as I said, some of that stuff is still relevant. I'm going to move over here. Computer. I have owned computers older than this, believe it or not. So let me tell you a couple of stories with computers. So I'm from, as I said, when I grew up, I was fascinated about computers. And unfortunately, I don't know why, but I never really used them. I was more fascinated about how they worked. So if you sense a little bit of regret, it's on me because I had the computers, and where I got them for was used places. I'd get them for like $10. So Apple IIe's, a bunch of old PCs, right? And this is when they had like PCI slots, if you're familiar with that is. And believe it or not, well before then, most of the ones that I had, actually all of them that I had either ISA slots or ISA or older. So they looked very much like this, but sometimes older. And the interesting thing is about these systems is I love just dinking around, messing around. Can I get it to work? How does this work? What is this DIN for? And playing around with these. Obviously, those skills have transitioned into what I do with my career since I work in technology. And honestly, back in the day, I could tell you what the slots were, the north side bus, the south side bus, the type of chipset you would see. This was later on as I got more intelligent about what I was looking at. What was on these type of expansion cards, floppy disk, all of this is I used to be so incredibly familiar with. But technology just moves so fast. Today I can tell you a lot about them, but not near as much as I could back in the day. And mostly what I know now is probably too old in terms of the exact specifications and stuff. But I've learned, at least for my career, it's less important. Get someone else who's really interested in that. Get a younger version of me as an example. But things will just continue to evolve, and I think being flexible enough and being okay with that is really important. That's the key to success in most, if not all, businesses. But I used to take these apart. So picture this. I didn't have a car. I only had a bicycle. That was my only transportation short of walking or running. And there was about 3 miles away, there was a used place. And so I would go down there for like $10 and I would buy a monitor and I would buy a computer. Because back in the day, sometimes you had to have the specific monitor, or maybe this was nicer looking. So many, many times throughout my childhood, I am biking up a hill, and I'm not kidding. I've got a bag, and on one side I've got a monitor, big CRT, 50, 60 pounds, and on the other side I've got a computer. And I can't tell you how many times I've done that. How dangerous I was, how desperate I was to find out what's inside is absolutely insane. When I think about it, I'm like, how did I not get killed? Because the road home was 3 or 4 miles, and I had to go up a hill, several hills, but a big one at the very start. And those cars were going 50, 60 miles per hour. And so I'm sure they probably thought, what in the world is this kid doing biking around it? But sure enough, I had a monitor on one side, and I used to, because they were tough back in the day, not the way things are built today, I could grab this thing by the power or the DB15M, usually the power because it was built in, you couldn't just unhook it like now, and it would lift the whole monitor. Was it designed for that? No. Was it built like a brick or like a tank? Hell yeah, it could take a beating. That's what I love about things like that back in the day. They had real quality. So needless to say, I probably carried monitors, CRTs, and computers on my bike probably like 2 or 3 dozen times. just nuts. Old type of connector. I think this is called PS2. Back in the day, they also had a DIN before that. So, and then of course, repairing the mouse with the ball and cleaning it inside. If you know what I'm talking about, let that sink in for a minute, because that means you've done it yourself. If not, carry on. Laser mouse is the way. And of course, these tactile keyboards. So a lot of fun taking these apart. A lot of fun replacing the chips or just playing with them. A lot of fun combining parts. Sometimes seeing what smoked. So that wasn't good, but happened before. And just trying to figure out. I remember in this era, right, 1990s. Just the hardware was so exciting because, you think of software and how new everything is. You go to your app store and it's like 25 things were added in the last 2 minutes. And if you want an app for something, it's there. In fact, it's like 30 different apps that do the same thing. And it's mind-boggling and annoying sometimes at how much stuff is there. It's hard to choose or hard to know what you're getting. Well, in the 1990s, hardware kind of moved at a similar pace because there was a lot of discoveries. And so you had to upgrade your computer. You had to upgrade the system board. You had to upgrade the power supply. Then you had to upgrade your floppy disk, because then maybe you want to use a zip drive, and then you couldn't use a zip drive, so you wanted to use a CD-ROM drive. Then you didn't want to use a CD-ROM drive, you wanted to write CDs, so you used a CD writer, and then you got a CD writer, and then there was a CD-RW, and then there was a DVD-RW. I mean, these were hardware changes that, to me anyway, were increasingly coming fast. Laptops that used to weigh pounds, and that no one cared how heavy it was, you just knew it was going to be heavy. Things just moved so quickly, but you could feel it. You could see it. It was tangible. You could smell it. Today's world, not so much. You can see it. That's about it. So this is a great example of how you can remove and uninstall floppy disk drives, hard drives, and this is still relevant today. People still use floppy drives. Believe it or not, people use hard drives, and the way that it's removed or added. Now, different connectors, right? This is IDE. I think it's 40 pin and 36 pin for floppy. But now they use SATA serial type of cable. So same type of hardware to some degree. I mean, people, again, some people will have hard drives that are 5 1/4. Hopefully not, but they do, or 3 1/2. And of course, you've got solid state now. But back in the day, a lot of this was removing, cleaning, putting it back, and you can see spraying it out because these guys had so many fans. So this just really just describes cleaning it. And there were different ways of how you install these drives. One thing that you can hopefully readily notice that you don't have to worry about as much it is. If you have old USB cables, you'll understand this. But they can only go in one way, right? Because if you go the other way, you're going to change the pin out. And so they physically design the apparatus not to go in. By the same virtue, a lot of these, this is a hard drive, so it's 40 pin. A lot of these had a colored cable, and that used to be called pin 1. So if you care to know, but also it could only go in one way. You could not take this ribbon cable out, pull it out with this blue part, flip it around and push it in. It was actually key. If you did that, you could actually bend the pin typically. But with these drives, they only could go in one way. These days, a lot of what we have here, you can do that both ways now, depending on what you have. Some of them are one way, but I remember this specifically because they were so wide. And before that, you had iSCSI, which was even wider. But putting these in sometimes was a little bit of a challenge and really annoying. If you ever had to deal with this and you had to have 2 or 3 components connected, and you had to get one cable twisted this way and this way just to get it to work. So this is just a continuation of repairing the computers. This I absolutely remember when I was young. Oh my goodness, this is just going to bring flashbacks. CMOS, or the complementary metal oxide semiconductor, basically needed to have a way for the computer to remember its settings. How does it know what time it is when you unplug it? Whether that's a laptop or your phone or whatever. And the way it did that is it still had a little battery inside. And so what you're seeing here is 2 variations of batteries that a computer could have. So it could remember settings if you booted from a hard drive versus a floppy disk. This is where it remembered it. If you wanted your CD-RW to operate at a specific speed, this is kind of where, this is not, sorry, it's not kind of, it is where it would remember everything, because inside these chips, or the BIOS chips, or CMOS, this is where it would store that data, but it was volatile. So if you took the batteries out, it would forget after a certain moment or two. And so that's why they had these batteries. And that's what they're talking about here, is replacing the batteries to keep the date and time chip. And the reason why that is because if you remove the batteries, it completely forgets everything. It wipes it out like it's brand new. Sometimes I think we as humans would love to be able to just wipe something off and be brand new. And then, as I said, a lot of these older connectors, you won't see many of these on the computers today, if any at all. You can see these are old SIM type memory cards. This one is definitely an old SIM. Believe it or not, even though these are standard old Rambus or type of memory chips, right? Single-sided or dual SIM, etc. I think that might be DIN. But I'm testing my memory as I do this, sorry. But there are equipment that use this. Do not for a moment think, oh, Daniel, that's back in the day. Nobody cares. Actually, let's pause for a moment. Printers. Many printers, including new ones today. Now, I'm not talking about the ones you can get at a store box office and they're like $100 or $200. I'm talking about ones that are designed for business, commercial grade. Ones that can print 1 million pages and just, no biggie. Those printers still use older memory. And a lot of times they do that is because it's cost. It's a proven technology and it's incredibly cheap because the chips are cheap. So a lot of the older printers still use SIM or DIM type of memory to expand it so it can print things faster or it can store more data. A lot of facility infrastructure that runs the HVAC, that runs security systems, believe it or not, right? That locks the doors at night for businesses. That has badge access. You badge in, you get in. A lot of those have microcontrollers that are old, believe it or not. They're not new. They're not like 2 years ago. You're not going to find an Arduino in there. You're going to find something that's literally like 15 to 30 years old. And you're going, what the hell are you guys doing running this? It's there because it's proven. It's cheap. And you know what? Let's just face it, a lot of these newer microcontrollers that you have to have a lot of software to run, these old ones, man, you programmed them, they ran until something smacked hard into it. And so they're proven. And so a lot of these older technologies exist because of that. And by virtue of that, cleaning the memory, replacing them, how to properly remove them is still relevant. So, just keep that in mind that, yes, it's old, but it's also kind of good to know. So if you get an opportunity to find an old computer, take it apart, have a little fun. It certainly isn't the genesis of everything today, but everything like technology always does builds up on its own. Beautiful printer here. I had one kind of like that back in the day. I was so jealous one time. BCG? I don't know, guys. The Canon bubble jet printers. I remember when they first came out, $25 a pop for the colored, and usually another $25 or $30 for the black and white. These things were a pain in the butt, but it was just magical back in the day to have something print off, right? The way the stepper motor moved the print head, the way the sheet advanced, it was like shh, 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 shh. That's what the sheet would sound like when those stepper motors were moving the sheet. The way that paper just perfectly advanced parallel and printed. Guys, back in the day, it was hard to just get something out. And when you could see it on paper, when you could smell it, it was beautiful. Here's how you used to clean those out. And again, this is relevant today. All the ones that are inkjet still use the exact same technology. It's more sophisticated, smaller ink nozzles, but there you go. So here's your inkjet. Here's the best way to clean it. This was a very common problem, especially if you had one stored away. I have a bunch behind me, unfortunately, that I've stored away. And now supposedly they clean themselves, but I don't know. If it's sitting there for 2 years and I plug it in, it's going to clean itself to nothing, because sometimes that ink just gunks up on the sides or gunks up inside that nozzle, which you can't see. Even if you have a beautiful magnifying glass, you just can't see it. And as a result, the thing just becomes trash. But that's what they're showing here. So this is still relevant, believe it or not. 2023, and this is still relevant. So I think that's pretty cool. And it's still very useful, absolutely. So that was some of the things that I would do on it. I have taken many of these apart before. If you see one, you're starting off as a hobbyist, do not throw these away. Do not throw these away. You'd be surprised how many of the belts, the stepping motors, the controllers, the readers, a lot of, they have platen rollers and metal inside. I'm telling you, keep these if you have them. Even if you have 10, you'd be surprised how much stuff you can use from these printers. It's pretty cool. Back in the day, they also had what's called dot matrix printers. These are printers that physically now, they got 9 or 16 pin. I can't remember all the pins, but they physically push on paper. And the reason they did that was to have copies. So they'd be a carbon copy, and then you have a paper. So you get basically a copy of everything you do. Really important if you work in business, because you typically want to be able to have a copy of what you print. I've worked in many jobs where they still use dot matrix printers. I don't think there's one here. Is there? That's fax. Okay, so that's what they're showing here. If you get an opportunity to play with the dot matrix printer, go for it. If you want to have fun, because you said, Daniel, it's 47 minutes into this video and I haven't had fun yet, do this. Look for, and you can do this with floppy drives too, look for videos that's like dot matrix music. Or search maybe like dot matrix printer music and do floppy drive music, because these used to all make noise. And when the floppy drive was trying to find its thing, or when it first loaded, like whatever, people have made music from them. I don't know. Pretty awesome how they've done that. But the point is, if you want to have fun, do that. Same thing with dot matrix printers. If you have some of these, keep them. They're fun to play with, and knowing how to fix them, you can make some real money from that. And I'm not kidding. Many businesses still rely on that. Faxes, repaired plenty of faxes. The number one thing I don't like about faxes, this is Daniel's number one, hates faxes. For as many buttons as the fax machines have, and I mean, I've repaired 5 dozen, let's say, from big enterprise ones that are 3 times bigger than me, all the way down to small ones. It bothers me that they're so complicated. I've always felt that the people who design faxes don't ever use them. And I don't mean that in an aggressive, mean way. I just mean the problems that they have are almost always program related. They're never clear. PCL5, thanks, that was clear. Right? You got a huge LCD on there, and yet you can't even give an error code the right way. They just couldn't self-diagnose very well, and paper got stuck in all sorts of areas like a printer, but faxes for some reason tend to be more difficult. You had to be a genius. You had to really look at the manual and figure out how all this stuff works and be fluently familiar, and then you go to another fax machine and it means nothing. You have to go through all of that again. Faxes, I've always found, I hate to say it, they're a pain in the butt, okay? They're just a huge pain in the butt. So if you have one, it's great for parts. If you're planning on using one, move on. All right. So for some of you, nostalgia time. All right, here we go. I still have cassette player. I don't have a Walkman, but I still have a radio, and many, many times repairing these. So again, You clean the tape head and the recorder if you have one on there. That was a really major thing. You look at the electrical components in the back of the battery. Make sure that those are clean. That used to cause an issue. You clean the rubber rollers around him. Really, really important. Maybe you blow it off, and hopefully that will fix it. There are some things you can do on the circuit board for some of these to fix, but it was very rare you could do that. The beautiful thing about this is when you're looking at the electronics of something like this, right, from the RF configurator all the way to the capacitors, resistors, and the line items, a lot of these you can fix. A lot of these you can right now get yourself a small soldering iron under $10. If you find one of these and you want to play around, use your voltmeter or your ammeter to try and figure out what it should be. YouTube the heck out of all this stuff because many people have probably repaired it, and go get it and do it yourself. All of this stuff is cheap and it's so easy to learn, and it's really fun. When you do something for yourself, you tend to have appreciation for not only repairing, but you have a ton of appreciation for yourself. Okay, story time. So this is a cassette player. This is, okay, well, yeah, it's weird. Okay, there's a big door for one cassette. So back in the day, I went to a high school, and I would always ask for broken electronics. It was, I mean, I don't know what my parents paid in trash duty, but it must have been substantial. One day, my principal said, and his name's Doug said, I've got a radio. I can't get it to work. If you can get it to work, great. If not, you can keep it. And of course, hey, bonus, if I can't get it to work, I get extra parts. I take it apart. I can't figure out what's wrong with it, right? You see this back board here? So I still don't know what to this day, what happened, but there was a But basically what happened is, if you take a look at this backboard, just as an example, you see these small little lines that are highlighted green. Those are all metal traces. They're pieces of metal that lie flat on the board and that go from one component to the other to send a signal, to power it, etc. That's what those are. Well, this is a pretty big piece of board. And as I was playing around with it, and I had batteries plugged in, I couldn't figure out how to work. By the way, it just wasn't starting up. I noticed that if I bent the board, and this was an accident, it wasn't a genius move, but if I bent the board a certain way, it worked. That was it. Now, to this day, I have no idea what caused it. It could have been a small component, maybe a battery lead, etc., coming undone. It could have been something on the circuit board. I don't know. But here was my fix. You ready for this? I couldn't figure out what it was. So I took the board off. I went into the bathroom and I grabbed a bunch of tissue paper and I kind of laid it flat about 12 times, and I put it behind where I suspected it was, and then I screwed everything back, and of course that bowed the board out, so kind of like this, right? And as I screwed them in here, 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 and here, it bowed out, but it was just enough, just like this, see? It kind of bowed it out. It was just enough that something on here connected and the thing worked. So toilet paper saved the day. I remember my principal says, there's no way you got to work with toilet paper. It worked. And he had it for years. I don't know whatever happened to it, but I know that he didn't throw it away because he kept saying, well, it worked. I'm not going to give it back to you. Dang. Sometimes it's pride, you know. I did that a lot. A lot of these, I wouldn't call them maverick fixes, but a lot of these fixes that you just don't know, but hey, you can kind of figure it out. So that's how I ended up repairing a radio. Is a trace or something had gone awry, and I didn't have a magnifying glass. Maybe this would have helped, but I didn't have a voltmeter to figure things out, and I didn't really know a lot about what I was looking at, but I knew enough to tinker around and play with. So fixed that, and I probably over my lifetime have probably repaired hundreds of radios in different capacities. Here's another quick example of how they're cleaning the laser. Now they're blowing air directly on the laser. If you have a CD player, do not do that. They're putting air on. A lot of these are just so strong. If you put them right on the laser eye and you were to put full force, that laser is being floated in the air. Very thin strands to keep that laser and the equipment up. It could be that you could spray hard enough that you could break one of those wires. They're very, very thin. So I wouldn't use too much air. Be careful, at least move the nozzle much, much further away than what they're showing in that picture. Otherwise, yeah, tons of radios. These are kind of the shelf radios that you would see. A lot of these still have great parts, still components. I have some that are 35 years old that still work. Some of them that are a little bit newer. So plenty of parts in a lot of these. And one of the first times that I really fell in love with I would say, true electrical engineering, because I loved radios. I loved the way that they transmitted. I was taking things apart left and right. Ask my mom, ask my dad. They didn't appreciate it. But I took everything apart. It didn't matter if it was electronic or not. Radios were one of those things that I couldn't just take apart and see, right? It communicates via electromagnetic radiation, i.e. AM and FM, and it gets its signals. And I studied, I forget what the exam was, but I remember when I was young, my first real certification that I was gunning for was actually in radio, learning how the technology worked. And I found it absolutely fascinating. I remember studying back in the day because you had to know Morse code. Today I do have my FCC license, my ham radio license, but back in the day, to me, it was just magical. And so I was studying up for it when I was really young because I wanted to learn, because I found something interesting, which was I couldn't see signals. I couldn't see how it worked, and it was fascinated by the things that I didn't know. To this day, it's still there. I have walkie-talkies, and I always tell myself, I wish I had more friends because then I could use them. Cell phones aren't the same thing, okay? For me, they're not the same thing. I don't care that I can call someone. Something about a Motorola walkie-talkie, a pager, a good AM or FM radio, something about that, maybe it's just the way that I grew up, to me, represents the curiosity, the discovery of the unknown, the excitement, the quality of how things are made. So when I see a radio, no matter what it is, I always have that appreciation. I actually found a Grundig radio, a travel radio, I bought for $20 at an estate sale not too long ago, because I've always wanted that brand, and I just thought they're just fascinating. So I'll stop talking about it. But radios, I've taken a lot apart. I have a lot of. And I still find them, the way they operate, just incredibly magical. And I have a background in electrical engineering. You would think that I would have done something with that. And I think if I had started earlier and not gotten another degree in between then, I probably would be. I'd probably be designing radios, working with telecommunications, right, ICT. But that didn't pan out that way. Basically what happened was, I could make money a lot quicker. Even though I had an EE degree, I could make a lot of money and pay for my living being in IT and management as a leader than I could, at least initially, as an electrical engineer. Please do not believe that should dissuade you from anything. That's just the way that my life ended up going. But obviously, I still carry a lot of that with me. So, here's another thing on radios. And here is CB radio, Citizens Band radio, 40 channels that truckers use to talk, right? Specific frequency. I believe I have, years ago, I made a YouTube video. You can look at it on FCC license and CB. So take a look at that if you're interested. Interesting enough, they're still talking about cleaning contacts. Now, one thing I didn't cover, cleaning button contacts. So back in the day, still a big thing now. Sometimes the buttons, the material that the buttons are made out of, sometimes underneath, or something gets in between them, and they just need to be cleaned. So a lot of those contacts, especially if they're on the circuit board, need to be cleaned. A little bit of rubbing alcohol usually solves that. I've probably done that with many of them, and that ended up being the issue, just the contacts of the buttons. Okay, so just moving right along. Security system. So this is pretty basic in how security systems work, at least from this page. These are just the different sensors that you can, right? Magnetic sensor, a physical button sensor that says something's open, something's closed, right, etc. But what I want to focus on is something to the right. Back in the day when I was a kid, I always found smoke detectors interesting, but I didn't really pay attention to them because, okay, guys, look. There's no parts in there. It's so simple. But I will say, I'm a homeowner now. And one of the first things I learned is that smoke detectors don't last forever. In fact, they usually have a 10 or 15 year shelf life. And the reason why it is because they have certain chemicals in here or metals that need to operate, and after a period of time, they become less functional. And when I moved into my new home, the home was 20-some years old, and one smoke detector started beeping. I looked at the back of it, saw that it was manufactured 15, 20 years ago. I think it was about 20 years ago. And so I actually looked it up, and sure enough, they said, yeah, you got to replace all of them. So I ended up replacing all of them, carbon monoxide and smoke detectors. But that's something I didn't know, that they don't last forever. So double check if you've got smoke detectors. Look in the back of it. It should tell you when it was manufactured, and look at the website. But they don't, they need certain types of chemicals, certain types of radioactive material in order to sense smoke. And the shelf life is X amount of years. And after that, they just degrade. And that's why a lot of them start beeping at you. It's not low battery. It may be indeed that it needs to be replaced. So certainly pay attention to that. Carbon monoxide detectors, I think, are very much the same way. Okay, story time. So this is really interesting. I've replaced, back in the day, phones for me were easy. I don't know why, but phones weren't complicated to me. And I went to a boarding school, and that means I got to know my teachers really well. And it also meant that I didn't get a free lunch very often, except for my trade craft. And I could repair phones. And I can tell you, back in the day, I went out to eat probably 2 times a month because I could fix these phones. Either the line was broken, the wire was broke, it got misconfigured, who knew, or we needed to add new lines or whatever it was. But this was all hardware. There was no software involved. It didn't have a complex phone system. It was, basically at most 4 wires, typically 2. And so what you're seeing here is how a typical phone works, how it's wired, and then how the wires get to each and every room. And the cool thing about this is a lot of this still exists today. By the way, let me explain. The reason I got a bunch of free lunches is because someone at home would say, the teacher would say, oh, my phone doesn't work. And I'd say, oh, I can fix it. And if it wasn't the phone, and I could take it apart. And if it wasn't the phone, it ended up being the line. And so I could trace the line, figure it out. Believe it or not, you guys are going to say, Daniel, what were you as a child? Because this is insane. I still didn't use a voltmeter, an ohm meter, a resistor, continuity tester back then. I used, let's just say, a 9-volt battery in my tongue. Not the smartest thing to do, but that's what I had to do. That's all that I knew back in the day. So please know how to use the tools. But that's how I knew when something would work, or I would re-crimp these, in other words, add them back. But it was something that I was good at. I could figure out, I could trace it. And as a result of that, teachers generally wouldn't give, kids money, but they'd say, hey, if you want to go out to eat, I'll pay for a meal. So they got, when I think about it, I always felt like, whoa, like I got self-pride, like I'm fixing something for them and I'm seeing as semi-intelligent, and because they couldn't figure it out, or they didn't want to figure it out, or they literally had no idea what to do. And I get a free meal out of it. And what they were probably thinking is, man, that kid went in there and fixed something, and I just saved myself $200. So maybe I should have charged more or gone to more buffets. I don't know. You guys tell me what you think. Put it in the comment section. But honestly, I did go to a boarding school for 7 years, and I went out and I got my meals paid for, which is a big thing, right, when you're a kid. And in a month time, 8 or 9 times I was gone. And a teacher was taking me out to eat, fixing something or other. So actually, now I'm starting to understand my weight gain. Tradecraft turns on you. So at any rate, I know that all the other cadets, it was a military school, all the other cadets were always very jealous. Where's he going? Oh, he fixed something else. And he's going, hey, but you know what? It is what it is. Sometimes I even brought a buddy with me to do that and to fix things. So anyway, that's what it was. I remember going and fixing many of these types of devices. And of course, these phones, pretty simple back in the day. So if you have a chance, you go to a garage sale or you go to a used place, open one of these up. They're just so fun. There's just something about the way that they're made, the quality, the fact that you can see the purpose. And maybe, I hate to call it this because sounds like I'm coming with something new, but I'm going to say it's new. I'm going to call it purposeful components. In other words, you could know what the purpose of a component was by its juxtaposition of other components, by what it was, like you could identify it's a speaker or a microphone, by virtue of what the device was. It wasn't complicated. They didn't have a ton of microprocessors all buried in one chip, one die, with just a couple of leads and that's it. You knew what the things were on a device. You could kind of figure it out just by looking. Here's a really great example. You've got the first pad, which has, which are the buttons, and then that gets a bunch of wires, go to this pad, and then from here, you go to the main board. Now take a look at this. You've got, let's look at this bottom board, right? You already, okay, so here's the connector that, oh, well, okay, they don't have that draw 2. I don't know what that is. Sorry, I'm looking through my camera. But if you take a look here, right, you've got, here's the connector, and it's probably going to be a 2 or 4 wire, right? And that's going to go to this board. So right off the bat, here's a switch, probably for volume loud, medium, and this is probably the ringer type. So right off bat, you know, those are 2 buttons. Here is the tweeter. Or in the old days, they had a bell, right? Ring, 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 like this guy, the bell assembly, right? You knew what this was. It's what's going to make noise. Here's the magnetic part. We'll just call it part. I won't get too specific. Solenoid that rung these back and forth, right? So you could figure it out what these parts kind of did, and then work your way backwards logically into what might be the problem. If the handset didn't work, maybe it's the cord, maybe it's the speaker or the microphone, or maybe it's a component in here. Pretty straightforward, because you could kind of figure it out logically what connected to what. These days, that's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. You need advanced tools to get that. But back in the day, you know, you could do that. So if we take a look at, there we go. So if we take a look at the next page, I think I mentioned this. I mean, this is yet another type of recorder, right? This is the telephone answering machine. I remember when my parents first got one, I was fascinated. Now, what fascinated me about these answering machines, which I kind of found annoying, because I always felt like they were a limited device of what a tape recorder was. And you might say, well, duh, that's the point. Yeah, but I mean, 2 seconds more and you could have had a really neat tape recorder. But anyway, an answering machine back in the day, it would record when someone left in the message and you had to go press play to hear what it was. These days we call it voicemail. It's all digital. Back in the day, you had a tape. You could even take it apart and listen to it on your cassette home or somewhere else on what someone's message was. This was kind of neat. I kind of miss this. Now, why, Daniel? Why the hell would you miss an old technology? Well, because think about it. Back in the day, this was a tape. And you could take things off a tape by, you had 2 tape devices, but you could play a message and record it with another one. So you'd have 2 recordings. But why that mattered? Well, imagine like someone sings you happy birthday. Imagine someone tells you an amazing, great story for like an hour and 10 minutes. It's on this tape. You can take it. You can physically keep it, store it away, copy it something else. You can't do that with voicemail. I mean, you can, but it's not the same thing. It doesn't feel like it's yours. But that is kind of cool that it had the cassette. And then soon after that, the tapes got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. That was just an excuse to sell different tapes and different things because they all stored the same thing. It's not like one quality was better than the other. All right. I think we're almost to the end here. So just stick with me and then we're almost done. Cool. All right. So TV, if you're going to repair a CRT TV, a couple things you should know. First, no joke, they have high voltage. It says it right here, but I'm going to tell you again, they have high voltage. You can seriously injure and kill yourself or burn yourself. Not a joke. I've done it, even though I knew it. I've only done it once. So I've been very careful. But I'm going to tell you again, TVs that are like this, right? Big screen monitor, big CRT or cathode ray tube, or older computer monitors, right? We saw one some time back here, right, where I was saying I was on a bicycle and I had to carry this big thing with me, right? They all are very heavy. They use cathode ray tubes to shoot electrons at the phosphorus screen, and because of that, they need a tremendous amount of voltage. And these voltages can be very dangerous to your health, to your skin, to your finger. So I can't find it here, but just trust me, when you have one of these, you have to be careful. So that means make sure it's unplugged. I would recommend you turn it on, even if it's unplugged, to drain some of the electricity out. But there's something you should know. Even if you unplug this TV, and even if you then turn on the TV to make sure you think the power's drained, back in the day, they didn't think anyone would go into them except people who knew what they were doing. There are components in here that can still store energy in a capacitor. Now that's really, really important to understand. Those things that kind of look like batteries all over the place, and you may not necessarily or readily identify the back of them, but I have heard years later of these capacitors still having a charge. So you have to be very careful taking these apart. Now I've taken apart back in the day probably 100, maybe more. The one I remember the most is the Sony Trinitron, because those were, first, what an amazing name. So Sony gets huge credits for that. To me, Sony Trinitron was great, but it was also famous because unlike all these curved convex CRTs, theirs was flat. And believe it or not, it made a whole huge difference in how that picture was viewed. Just crisp, beautiful. It is what it is. But Sony Trinitron made one. And the reason why I remember this story especially is, and as I said, I went to a boarding school. And that meant that I lived, right, at the school, right? It's a boarding school, it's a military school. And the interesting thing about that is one day we had the principal of the middle school come, and he said, Daniel, the speakers now guys, I will tell you, this is a little bit of a story that's, I wouldn't say dishonest, but let's just call it dishonest. Okay. So this is how I also became a Trekkie fan. So you get to hear two things in one. So he said, oh, the speakers aren't working for this TV. This was back in the day where you had like a big CRT TV, and it was on a cart with speakers. So you like move the whole thing around. You'd cart it from one room to the next. That's how you had your TV. We didn't have flat screens in every TV and in everyone's pocket back in the day. That's all that you had for a TV. So when it was movie day, it was really fun. You could hear, oh, who's having a movie day? Because you hear the cart going clink, 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 clink as they drag that with the VCR or a DVD player to someone's classroom. The beautiful thing about this is, I remember very clearly the principal said, we just can't get the speaker to work. There's no sound. And I said, well, I got to take the TV with me and I need the sound with me. And I was just so excited. Even now, I'm like just giddy. I was like so excited. I'm going to figure this out. So excited to have something so, to me, huge. And believe it or not, I had to have a friend help me take it to my room because I was up on the second stairs of this next to a stairwell where my room was. But I brought the cart and the speaker, and I got it fixed in 2 minutes. Yep, 2 minutes. They didn't plug the speaker wire in. That was the issue. They did not plug the speaker wire in. And you know what? Too bad. I remember thinking, oh, I got it fixed. And then I was so excited. Like, I'm going to tell them that I got it fixed, that I got it working. And then that night, I turned on the TV. I made a makeshift antenna. And guess what was playing? It was a Star Trek TNG episode. And I said, wow, this is cool. This is cool. I had never, by the way, had a DVD player. I had VHSs, but I didn't watch movies. So it's not like I would fix things, but I usually returned them. I didn't really keep them. I just wanted it for the knowledge, for the learn. I didn't really care about using them. Watching Star Trek on this flat screen Sony Trinitron with this beautiful center speaker that had, I think, 2 speakers in it was magical to me. And I didn't return that TV, not for days, not for weeks, not for months, but until the end of the semester. Said, yeah, it's just taking a long time, and they only asked once or twice. They got a different TV. And every single night I watched Star Trek with my roommate. And it was our secret, and we loved every minute of it. So that is actually how I became a Star Trekkie, by fixing something incredibly simple and then watching. So I didn't really watch anything else on the TV, but it came in crystal clear, and it was just gay old times when I was that young. So sometimes a little bit, a quick fix, like a wire to a speaker is all it took. So if my principal is now watching this video, and I am sorry, that I may have misled, but it was 25 years. Get over it. School doesn't even exist anymore. But it's just an amazing story because it brings together like how I became a Trekkie fan, that my craft of fixing things and all things electronics, how that kind of imbued itself into how I grew. Obviously supported myself, but just when you think back in the day, that's something that always strikes me as a bit funny, but very homey to me. So at any rate, I didn't have to take the TV apart. I did actually open the back of the TV, but I never had to repair anything because it just worked. So that was quite fun. I think we're getting to the end here. So remote controls, this is still pretty relevant. What they're showing here is cleaning. So these pads on the back of this remote, so there's buttons on one side, just like this, right? Buttons. But when you press down, it connects to the back of the circuit board. And when it does that, it actually completes a circuit just underneath each one of these buttons. That's how it knows what button you're pressing. Underneath, there's call it 2 wires as an example. And when you press volume up, that's ground, and the volume up button comes together and it says, you press volume up. When you go to the volume down button, right, under that button might be ground and the signal for the volume down button. Same with the power, same for the mute, same for the channel. Sometimes underneath those buttons, they get dirty or the button degrades a little bit. So the button sticks or you get you press one thing, you get another. What they're showing here is how to clean that. So you just take a swab, you clean the back of it. I usually just use alcohol, 75% or above, and that will typically clean that right away. So that's what they're showing here, right? Very similar to what we've seen other things, right? Like when a battery or other buttons break down. So yes, here again is another example of a computer screen and a television. So many of them had speakers built in. Never really had any of these go bad that I'm aware of. Most of the time it was, here's an example of the fuse or another component that was going out. And then here's an example of a computer monitor. Very similar to how a TV is made, right? Other than the signal input isn't coming from RF or coaxial cable, right? This one had data because it was DB 15 amps. So a type of data connector back and forth. Everyone now sees it as HDMI. Well, back in the day, they had a longer name that meant something that told you a lot more about the signal and the type of cable it is than HDMI. If you know what DB15M stood for, it meant something. So about its point. So again, an important caution, right? It says that there can be components in here that can store electricity, and it's not kidding. It can be tens of thousands of volts. So please be very careful. All right. So we've got antennas. No biggie there. I mean, it is, but it isn't. And then again, here's the different connections that you used to have on the back of a TV, right? RF filters to help clean the signal or to remove just kind of dirty data. Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. It's been an hour and 20 minutes and we haven't talked about video camcorders. All right. When I was like 10 or 11, I found a camcorder that was colored. It was tape, and it was older than this. It like this here, because this has a battery pack, suggests that it was probably this big, right? The one that I found, let me go the other way. The one that I found was huge, heavy, so heavy. And there were 2 of them. One of them, I think, was for, if I recall, one of them was for the actual camcorder. There was a second component to this, and I can't quite recall what it was for. I think it was the battery component, and it actually was a backpack. So you'd have a backpack full of a battery and components connected to your video camcorder. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, can clarify, by all means, please do so. I remember it was the coolest thing, and the neatest thing of all this, in my mind, was the viewfinder. The ability to view what it was seeing, and the one that I had was on an LCD, was amazing. I mean, I was like, whoa, this is new stuff. So that was really fun to play with. I never fixed any one of these because they were very complex, a lot of circuit boards, a lot of tight things. Admittingly, I don't recall anyway getting one that was broken, but I don't recall ever fixing these. I recall taking these things apart and leaving them apart. It is what it is. Here's a really great example of what I mean about the complexity. You can see how much circuitry. That is all circuits with a bunch of wires around here. And just when you think you can't have any more, the hardware that does the recording, the processing, the audio, look at that hardware. It's stock full. And that is not the end of it. It goes all the way through. This entire camera module has a bunch of motors and stuff going through there. So it really was complex. Not a lot of things you can fix with it. So there were, I think I maybe made some color adjustments, but if these were bad, at least with my capability, they stayed bad. VHSs, what does that stand for? Video home recorder, maybe? I actually don't know. VHSs, dime a dozen when I grew up, they were much easier to fix because they had a ton of room. Look at this. That's like these old cars, right? These old cars, you could see the engine and you could stick your half a body in between the engine and the chassis. Now can't stick a finger in there. But look how huge, how much room there is because these tape decks just took so much room. I'm not really sure why they had to be that big, to be honest. I think it was everything else like the VCR, sorry, not the VCR, like the amplifier and the tape deck. I think because they were all like a standard size, I honestly think they made VCRs that standard size. In other words, they wanted it set-top box VHS device to have the same dimensions as the compact disc player, as the tape player, as the 8-track system, and I think that's why they made this the same length and width, was just because of that. I'm going to assume that that's why, and I'm going to stick with it. And then this talks a little bit about if there were issues right when it was playing, whether it was wiggles, bend a stop, dropout, track error. Track error is the one I typically have seen the most. Usually that meant cleaning the reader head. One time I ended up replacing the bands around here. I ended up replacing with a rubber band, and that worked. Other times I just didn't. There wasn't a ton of parts in here that I knew what to do with. Now I know I could have really attacked it and looked at it component level, but when I was a kid, I didn't necessarily know what everything here was, so I would look physically and try and logically conclude what came with what was responsible for what, driving what. Okay, so moving past video recorders. Okay, and the last thing is, video recorder. So same thing. The last thing is these tape decks. If you have a VCR and VHS, they're always still fun to look at. My parents have a whole bunch of them. Now they paid a company to convert them to DVD because, again, they only last so long before the tape starts to degrade or the way that data is encoded on starts to just wear away. But I did one time, someone had a tape and it came undone, and I fixed it by cutting tape off and then merging it together with Scotch tape. Yes, Scotch tape was actually stronger back then, I think. And then that worked. That saved a tape from someone literally throwing something out that was a family reminder of a great event. And we got to keep it. So some of the stuff is still pretty relevant. This is from like 8 tracks or bigger tape reels, showing how that can be cleaned, or the clip that goes onto it. I've actually messed with these before too. They're kind of fun. Again, they're very tangible, right? You know what you're dealing with and you can figure out what you're looking at. So otherwise, so thanks for watching. Hopefully this brought back some memories. Hopefully you learned something about, me, if anything else, obviously of what we covered. Feel free to leave comments below, questions, provide your own story. Would love to read what others have. I think that it's a great way to share information. And, for me, it's a little bit of reliving, which is a little scary when I think back like, oh my goodness, but it's always fun. thanks for watching. Subscribe, leave comments, and let me know if you have any recommendations.